the recording and make Kevin the host, and you can go ahead and share at that point.
All right, so let's see here. Give me just a second and I'll be ready momentarily. Let's see here. How's everybody doing today, by the way? Staying sane?
What's that?
Doing good.
What's that? Too funny. All right, let's see here. I'm gonna gotta turn on my I'm sorry I didn't get all my slides and all that stuff properly staged for the session, and lately my machine also has been quite slow, but that's part of what I'm dealing with these days with sanity. I'm not doing a very good job of it, so I apologize that it's a little bit slow in starting here.
Oh, not a problem.
Okay, now let me, I've got that going, and let me flip over to Zoom. Now, one other thing I will mention as well, friends, is that the raffle is like going to be a great chance for you to win something. It's a $100 gift card, and the idea is we usually spend that much money on, say, buying pizza for everybody at the user group, something like that. And so in this case, since we can't do that, we're not meeting, right? Why don't we send some lucky winner to a nice restaurant, right? Most cities now are at least allowing half occupancy. So we're still giving out the $100 gift card, so you and your family can go out and enjoy a nice meal on us. Also, I'm going to give away a couple freebies at the end of the session as well today. So we'll have a couple different ways for you to win. But if you don't mind your, I guess you could say your email address and providing a little bit of information to Century One, your chances are going to be great, because a lot of people are either not that motivated or they don't want to share information. So you've got probably a 1 in 10 chance to win this $100 gift card. So I encourage you to do that. Also, as a fellow technical person and not a salesperson, one thing I will say about Century One is that our salespeople really do try very hard to act the way we, the core group at Century One, when we were DBAs, always wanted salespeople to act with us. So if you just say, look, I don't have budget, don't call me anymore, they'll stop calling you. So the only time I've known someone to say, oh gosh, I keep getting calls, Kevin, what are you going to do about it? And I said, have you ever talked to the person like one time and said, I don't want to talk? He's like, no, I've never done that. I said, okay, well, I'll tell them you don't want to talk, but just let you know, we're not that kind of company. Kevin points to various competitors out there in the marketplace. We're not that kind of company that's going to hound you relentlessly. Okay, so we've got 2 sessions today. The first one is top 10 DBA mistakes. And this is intended for both middle tier DBAs and new DBAs, or perhaps you're a generalist and you have to do some DBA work yourself. But that wasn't what you intended to do. You started out maybe being a sysadmin, or maybe the smartest SQL person on the dev team. So now you've got to start handling all of these kinds of responsibilities. And believe me, every one of these stories is backed up by hard knocks on my part, where I had to learn the hard way. The second session we're doing today is actually a deeper dive on one of the top 10 DBA mistakes. So, and that's one in which I've actually asked Dan if he will actually participate with me and show you a little bit in the demos. And it's a kind of session, I think both of these sessions are ones that our friend David Kline, who's with us today. Hi, David. He could give you the exact same session, except he'd have all different stories about how he had experienced these problems as well. So this is kind of tried and true institutional knowledge for the long-term DBA to share with the rest of the community out there. If you are interested in getting more of these sessions, there's a couple ways you can get this content, and I'll show you in just a second, okay? The first thing, though, is an obligatory commercial from my employer, Century One. And so the main thing I want to kind of emphasize is not our technology. Although our technology is the best in the industry, it gives you the most information, the deepest granularity, and more information than anyone else at the lowest overhead. So I'm bragging a lot about how great we are in that regard. But the thing that I really want to kind of pass along about Century One is in the lower right-hand corner of this slide, which is our attention to detail of customer service. So again, like I said, the core group at Century One, when we were building up this company, we always kept front of mind that we want to treat our customers the way we wish we had been treated when we were DBAs and developers and such in our background. And so you get white glove treatment if you ask for it, you know, with any of the products. And our support is second to none in the industry. Our innovation is second to none in the industry. And meaning the rate of new features and capabilities that we release. So, you know, give us a try if you're in the market for tools to help with monitoring, optimization, alerting, and building products on SQL Server or any of the Microsoft data platform. These are our products. One in particular I want to draw your attention to is Plan Explorer. We're approaching about 1 million users of Plan Explorer with about 3 million downloads over the last 10 years or so. No, it's not quite 10 years. It's more like 8 years. And the product makes query tuning the way it should be. It makes it much easier and much more informative. But on top of that, it's free. And not just free, it's so free we don't even ask for an email address. So there's no risk at all. We want everyone in the community to take advantage of this great set of tools and, you know, just make it a part of your everyday toolkit. And if you write T-SQL code, you should definitely have this product. Our two flagship products are SQL Sentry, which covers monitoring for and alerting optimization for SQL Server. And then we have versions for analysis, integration, and reporting services. We have versions for everything that runs in the cloud. That's that whole list of monitoring solutions you see there. And then another product of ours is called S1 Document, and it's a software as a service product you can get online, or you can buy it on premise. But the gist of that product is, how many of us like doing documentation? Well, I've yet to meet somebody who really loves that, except maybe a team documenter. And so what this does is it not only builds out your data dictionaries for all of your different database and data related repositories, so things like data warehouses and stuff, but it also builds the data lineage between anything that connects to them. So if you wanted to pose the question, if I change a data type on my staging server, what other places do I have to change that data type? And so the data lineage information aspects of the product would tell you, well, you've got to change your SSIS ETL processes, you've got to change the production SQL server, and you have to change the ETL processes that push that data over to the data warehouse, as well as the data warehouse itself. And that's kind of a superpower. If you've ever had to do a project like that, like I have, we had to spend 2 or 3 weeks detangling either detangling what we did have or just completely rebuilding all the documentation. So it's really a great product and I love it a lot. So that's the kind of stuff we make and provide to the market. There's also a ton of free stuff. So I mentioned that you can see these webinars, at least in earlier versions, maybe where our slide deck backgrounds were different. But if you go to Webinar Library, you can see all of the recorded videos. Those are cool. Along with the scripts and the slide decks. You can go to centuryone.com/resources. That's where we've got our ebooks. And then the other 2 bullet points here are for our blogging site. So SQL Performance is really hardcore, in-depth SQL Server performance tuning advice. And then blogs.centuryone.com is for all the kind of personal blogs of the team, For example, anytime I do a public webinar, I always follow up with lately, last year or so, been following up with all the questions that came up during the session and all the questions we didn't have time to answer in the Q&A time slot for the session. So you'll always see, follow-up emails for that kind of stuff from me. There's one other URL that's not on the list here, and that's centuryone.com/Kline. And that's a landing page that just has a whole bunch of my slide decks and scripts. Not the videos, but if you just want the slides and scripts because you attended one of my sessions, then you can get this session and the next one that we're going to do after this. You can already get those right now. Okay, so for those of you I haven't met, I apologize for burning a lot of time on this. The main thing I want to get across is that I would really enjoy connecting with you on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Twitter. If you want to email me, please do that. If you don't want to connect, but you want to follow me, then I write a monthly column for Database Trends and Applications magazine. And my career, as Daniel had pointed out, has been a long one, now that I think of it. I started in the mid-'80s working for NASA down in at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. And one of my first jobs there was on the team that built the water recycling system in the space station. And we wrote the database management system, the laboratory information system, using Fortran and SQL. And the reason for that was because stored procedures hadn't been invented yet. And so if you wanted parameters and while loops and if statements and things, you would write all that in Fortran and then embed your select statements and inserts and so forth inside of that and run it through a compiler. And that's how you would get procedural control of your code. I wrote a book, my first book, it was an Oracle book towards the end of that tenure. And then I went on to work at some of the really big Microsoft SQL Server shops throughout the 90s. It was during that time that I and 8 other people got together and founded PASS. And if you don't know anything about PASS, you're actually a member because you're a member of a local chapter of PASS. And then also throughout all those many years, I have written more books. This is my best known book out of 11, SQL in a Nutshell. And we'll give away 2 copies of that in a raffle at the end of the session today. So what we'll do there is I've got my D&D dice right here, ready to go. And we can just count up the number of people who are attending and make a roll to see who on that list has won, or we can figure out something to give away a couple of the ebook version of that book. It's about $45–50 right now from O'Reilly. So we'll give you a nice little free treat for that as well. So today's session, the first session, is about top 10 DBA mistakes. And this doesn't include things that are related to databases, but not an administrative function. So some of the things that we're leaving out of this session today are mistakes that are largely developmental in nature. So an example of that would be database design and normalization. That's often something that DBAs do, but it's not an admin function. So we're not going to cover that kind of functionality. We're also not going to cover things like scalability testing and benchmarking and baselining. Now, when I'm interviewing senior DBAs, I ask probing questions on their skills in that area because I believe that's something that a senior DBA with many years of experience should know how to do. However, it's not strictly administrative in nature, and so that's something that I don't dive into in this session. And some other things, like I have tons of content on query tuning. I think there's over 10 or 12 hours of query tuning on centuryone.com/webinar library. But we're not going to go into that because that's a mixed role that a lot of developers do all the query writing and query tuning. So there's certain things we're going to exclude, but what we're covering today are the things that employ DBAs on a day-by-day basis. Okay. So the first mistake that I see DBAs making all the time is that when we think about storage, we're thinking about our storage subsystems as a volume of space and not IO throughput and speed. And this is one of David Klee's specialties. Here joining us in the meeting today, and has spoken to your user group in the past. But one of the things that we often find, particularly in bigger, in bigger enterprises, is that when a DBA gets together and discusses their needs for storage with, say, a SAN admin, they'll usually say something along the lines of, hey, we've got a new database system coming online, and we're going to need 20 gigabytes of space to start with, and it'll probably go at about 5 gigabytes a year, something like that. And because SAN administrators are always so helpful and lovely people, they will say, of course, happy to do that for you. And no one really looks into whether that storage space that they're giving you somewhere in the SAN infrastructure, whether that's really robust. For example, with newer systems, you probably already know that they're SSD based. And so like if you bought a pure storage array, there's probably not a lot of choices you're making there. But on many of the systems out there, we might have tiering. So we have cheaper stuff for longer term storage, and then medium speed hard disks or high speed hard disks. And then we have a layer that is just high speed SSDs. So they haven't inquired about what your throughput needs are. And so they might create some LUNs or some space for you on that medium tier, and allow the SAN storage software to take care of auto tiering for you, when in fact that's actually not going to be a very effective solution for what your specific application needs. And that's simply because we as DBAs are not really used to thinking about storage systems as one of the leading corollaries for high performance. We're just used to thinking about it as gigabytes of volume. And so you got to change that way of thinking in your head. There are some other really fundamental aspects of IO subsystems that used to be at the forefront of our mind back when all we had were hard disks. And the reason for that was hard disks were crazy slow by comparison to the CPU and memory of a SQL Server. And so that still hangs around a little bit. Again, it depends on the SAN vendor and maybe the way you have configured your storage if you're not using a SAN. So you might have a situation in which you can choose how you want to create a RAID array in your IO subsystem. And there's a lot of information out there about how it's cheap and easy to create a RAID 5. RAID 5 is uses parity bits to ensure that if any one of the disks in the RAID array fails, let's say it's defined as drive E, then drive E stays up even though one drive in that mix fails. The alternative most popularly is either RAID 1, in which we mirror a pair of disks, or RAID 10, in which we have striping across multiple mirrored disks. And so that's more expensive because you've got more of these disks to worry about in a single drive letter. The thing is, though, if we go with that cheaper RAID 5 array, it is about 300% slower for certain activities, in particular for write operations. And the reason for that is because every time we write a bit that goes to any of the disks, it also has to write parity bits across the array so that it can recover if one of those drives fails. And I just mentioned the other keyword about RAID 5 arrays, which is recovery. So they take a lot longer to recover than a standard mirrored pair, RAID 1, or a striped and mirrored pair, RAID 10. So again, we're not thinking about the disks as speed. We're thinking about them just as the storage volume that we need. And so the speed comes in many forms. How quickly it answers your OLTP or OLAP workloads, or how quickly it can do backups and recovery. So start changing the way you think about space, storage. It needs to be as much about speed as it is about anything else, okay? For those of you who are able to move over to SSDs, they're great. They're so much faster. And in fact, Microsoft recognized this, and even in more recent versions of SQL Server, they've given us special configuration and architectural options so that we can take advantage of how fast SSDs are. For example, there's a new feature, newish feature, a couple releases ago, they introduced a feature called buffer pool extensions. And so you can actually use this really fast SSD, which again is an order of magnitude slower than memory, but it's a heck of a lot slower than hard disks. So, I'm sorry, heck of a lot faster than hard disks. So you can use that SSD space as an extension of your data cache. And so it can actually accelerate a lot of the work you do by having kind of an internal second tier of caching that's much faster than disk. It's also part of the reason why we have things like delayed durability, which is a feature that accelerates the transaction logs behavior. So some cool stuff out there. Also, you know, there's other good benefits of SSDs. For example, they use a lot less energy. And I had a friend who at one of the places I used to work in the data center there switched out thousands of servers, hard disks for SSDs. And by the end of the year, they had chalked up about a $65,000 savings on their electric bill compared to hard disks. So good stuff. The flip side though, and I think this is getting much better than it used to be, but in the old days when a hard disk started to go bad, and again, people like Dan and David, and they could hop on and tell their own stories about this, but you had warning when one of your hard disks was going to go bad. You'd start getting errors, 605 errors and things like that. And then 2 weeks later, it'd finally die. But with SSDs, a lot of the times they're working perfectly well, and then they just, you know, and cartoon character X's over their eyes, and they're dead and gone. So that's another reason why you want to make sure you have those in RAID arrays or some kind of disaster recovery, high availability arrangement there. So business ignorance. This is one of those aspects of DBA mistakes that is not really technology related. There is a component that is somewhat about the technology, but it's twofold, okay? The first is you are the IT professional who maintains the SQL Server itself, and the database and databases are way more important, to be honest with you, than most other parts of the IT infrastructure. So let me extend this analogy a little bit. If you look at the best sources of information about how to lead teams, this would be consulting companies like McKinsey, or business schools like the Harvard Business School or Chicago School of Business. You know, one of the kind of teams that they point out that are kind of the epitome of a really high functioning team are, believe it or not, they're racing pit crews. And so one thing you have there is a high degree of specialization. Everybody knows their job extremely thoroughly. But the flip side is everybody knows how the machine that they're working on, how it works, right? So they know brakes, they know steering system, suspension systems, they know the engine, the fuel mix, and all those kind of things. We're kind of the pit crew for our SQL servers. And yet, I can't tell you how many DBAs I've met over the years who, if you ask them to tell you what the checkpoint is, or what the lazy writer does, or how does SQL Server decide when to evict things from the cache so it can load new things, they don't know. They don't have a clue. And I've had them tell me they're senior DBAs under those circumstances. And I'll tell you, that's not a math that works out. You know, you can't say you're senior if you don't know how the internals of the system work. And in fact, I was so burdened by this that I've done a series of webinars on the internals about the bare minimum that you need to know to consider yourself a high quality DBA. The other really important thing, and I learned this early after switching from being a developer. I was a developer for 6 years and moved into database administration. I had the wrong idea in my head. So back in those days in the early 90s, buying a high-end database server was $100,000 or more proposition, just the hardware, before we even got to the SQL Server licenses. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. We spent like $160,000 or $180,000 on this one server from Compaq, if you remember that company name. And I knew at some point it was going to fail. We built in all kinds of high availability and redundancies to prevent that or avert that from happening. But eventually the day came when it did have a really serious crash. And I got a call from the CIO, but the CIO didn't say what I expected them to say. What I expected the CIO to say was, Kevin, what the hell's going on with my server? We spent a fortune on this thing. How long before we can get this repaired and up and running? And that wasn't what they said. They said, Kevin, my God, what happened to our data? When can we get that data back online? And, I had a revelation. This whole time I had been protecting the wrong assets. I was thinking because we'd spent a lot of money on the servers, I was thinking that the servers were the asset. But at the end of the day, that's like the bottle that you put a priceless vintage of wine in. It's the wine in that bottle that's so valuable. It's the data in that server that's so valuable. And so we as DBAs are guardians of that most important asset of the information technology division of a company. There are some other things related to that new understanding I had that I learned. For example, the kind of data that you have is enormously important, and you need to know it thoroughly as the guardian of that asset. So on the one hand, I like to tease other roles in IT, like one of my best friends a couple doors down from me here for a long time was the head of the exchange group at the company that I used to work at and he's still at. And, for him, every email was equally important. And so if he had to recover some emails that were lost, so be it. Let's get to work on that email. The networking guys, for them, although a router might go down or a hub might have problems, it was all TCP IP packets to them. There was nothing intrinsically more valuable about one TCP IP packet than the next. However, as I've gotten more experienced over the years, I've encountered DBAs who ran the radiology information system. And as opposed to some DBAs who handled one of the country's biggest floral services company, if you want a flower arrangement or something like that. And the way they treated their data was night and day different. Because if you have an issue with some floral data, well, okay, that's important. Somebody's going to be disappointed. But the way you react is very, very, and prepare for emergencies is very, very different than for the teams who supported radiological data, because people's lives were on the line with that data. And so the kinds of backup systems they had and disaster recovery and business continuity systems they had were entirely different. And that's because the DBAs knew what was on the line with their data. Another aspect of this is that if you learn your job well and you learn what your business is about and the data that your business is storing, then you also really need to learn what is important for the business in terms of their business cycles. For example, for a long time, I worked for a big accounting company. And really, don't plan any new big projects between the end of the year and April 15th if you work for an accounting company, because that's the busy season. You got to get your taxes done on April 15th. So in the year, there were those business cycles, but then there were also end of month, end of quarter, end of the week stuff that managers would do. There were business cycles that were really busy at the end of the day within a 24-hour period. Lunchtime, it'd be really slow, so you could do some preventative maintenance work if you needed to. You got to know that kind of stuff if you want to be considered the irreplaceable member of the IT team. And DBAs who do this well absolutely earn that position on their team, where they are the most respected member of the IT team. You're always invited to those important business decisions about what is going to happen with the technology. But you have to stop focusing solely on the technology and start to understand what the business does overall. And so you do that, you avoid making a major mistake that many DBAs do, which is to just focus on the routine technology tasks like backups and recovery and preventative maintenance and so forth. Okay, there's a couple sites here I also wanted to point out to you. PASS has a professional development virtual chapter and meets every month. So you can get lots of kind of career development information there. There's a really good website called techrepublic.com that also has a whole section for management of technology and working with co-workers and stuff like that. So those are some good places to learn more. And then SQL Performance is one of my references because of all the great information about all of these deep internals inside of SQL Server. Another kind of blunder I see people make is they just try to figure stuff out on their own and they hope that it helps, or hope that they get there. And one thing that's really, really good about our community, it's in fact way better than other groups that I have worked with in the past, say Oracle or someone like that, is that we have all kinds of ways in which this community is aggressively helpful and friendly and shares. So the main thing I want to get across here is why so many people are on Twitter in our community and why you should be as well, even if you're not. And the main thing here is a lot of people will sign up for Twitter, and really all Twitter shows is this one column right here. Everything that anybody that I follow tweets will show up in that one column in this kind of stream of consciousness that's not really useful. The trick in making good use of this is to use the tweetdeck.twitter.com interface. And with TweetDeck, you can create, oh, look at that, David Cleese right there on the list. You can get your messages directly from friends and coworkers, notifications if someone else has mentioned you. For example, they are replying back to something you put on Twitter. And then one of the most helpful things of all is the SQL help hashtag. So if you are interested in just about anything in the world, let's say you're really into the NFL and you're following your local sports ball team. I'm not really a sports fan, so I don't know. Tennessee Titans or the Colts, or what do you got in Kansas City? The Chiefs?
That would be accurate. We do have the Kansas City Chiefs, the Super Bowl, the 2019 Super Bowl winners. So yeah.
Oh yeah, that Super Bowl thing. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, you could put NFL or you could put hashtag Kansas City Chiefs or something like that, and you'd see everything that people were talking about there. Maybe fantasy football. But SQL Help is great because if you put a question out on SQL Help, you will get an answer usually within 3 to 5 minutes, not always. And the more niche the question, the longer you might have to wait. But if you're asking just general SSMS or general SQL Server questions, or maybe a question about some T-SQL coding, you'll get great answers very quickly. You may have heard of Glenn Berry, for example. He's written this fantastic collection of DMV queries and popularized those. So, just great resources out there who are willing and eager to help you out. All right, so let's move on. This is the one I mentioned earlier that's going to be the second session in today's webinar, Troubleshooting Methodology, okay? I once was helping out a DBA who actually knew my number, gave me a call when they were in a trouble situation, and they said, I said to them, what's the first step when you have a really problematic situation? You got to solve the problem, and people are waiting on you, watching you to see what the resolution is and how long it takes. And he said, well, the first thing I do is panic. Yeah. And I was like, you're not joking, are you? He's like, no, I'm not joking. I panic totally. It's like, wow, okay, well, let's not do that. And so, as I mentioned here on the final bullet point, I do have this session recorded. And if you're interested, you can go and watch that anytime. If you have time, stick around, and we're actually going to go through the troubleshooting methodology that I typically use in the vast majority of troubleshooting situations I'm in. Methodology, remember, is just a fancy word for checklist, really. What's your methodology? What's your step-by-step process for handling a specific situation? And so think about this. You think about airline pilots. They have a checklist for every single outcome you can imagine. You know, one engine burns out. What do I do? There's a checklist for that. There's somebody who's unruly in the cabin. There's a checklist for that. You know, everything you can think of. One of the toilets is broken. They have a book that has a checklist for everything in there. In a similar way, there's been some really interesting research about the highest performing hospitals in the world. And the World Health Organization several years ago began to notice in some of their research that there were certain hospitals in the third world, in poor countries, that had fractional funding compared to a top-notch US hospital or Canadian or English hospital. And so they sent some researchers out to study what was going on there. And what they discovered was in these understaffed, resourced, under-provisioned hospitals, what they were doing was they had very sensible checklists for all the kinds of activities that they would normally do to support their patients. And not just doctors, but the nurses were empowered to stop things from happening if a checklist was not being followed properly. So it's really interesting how powerful just having a well-known step-by-step process to get to the root cause of your performance problems. So also, there's a really good troubleshooting guide. It's a 200-page book. You can get it on simpletalk.com. It's written by Jonathan Cahias. And we're old buddies, Jonathan and I was kind of surprised because we had both developed our content, my presentation and his book separately, but we basically agreed all the way down the line. So get a hold of either one of them and acquaint yourself with that process for figuring out problems, and you're going to be in a very strong position as a DBA because you can keep things running smoothly. And if you can't do that, it's going to be hard to add value because you're basically bailing out the ship while you're trying to pilot it. And this will really help you a lot. Another thing that we find is that I don't know exactly what percentage. I was going to say maybe 60% of DBA shops that I find don't have a lot or any kind of alerting set up. And I'll tell you right now, one of the biggest mistakes you can make as a DBA is to manage your workload by how much the phone rings, by having people complain about what you're getting done or not getting done, or what's on fire and what's not on fire. So I'm actually not going to step out to, well, I guess I will. I'll go to Management Studio here and show you a little bit about this. Setting up alerts. It's an extremely important thing to do. If you don't have any alerting at all, you don't have a product like SentryOne or some of the other vendors out there, you do have alerting. It's built right into Management Studio. It's just a very basic level of monitoring. So what you could do is you can go to, by the way, Jonathan, is this coming through?
We can see what you're doing, Kevin. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So what you would need to do is go to SQL Server Agent in Management Studio. There's also, of course, management stored procedures and so forth to handle this. And you'll see there's jobs right here. It takes a little bit more than just, it takes a little bit more than alerts. You'll see jobs, that's what everybody uses, but alerts are what we're interested in. You have to do a little bit more than that though. At a minimum, you have to create some operators. An operator is a email address basically that's going to receive the alerts. So in this case, I have two operators. One is super awesome DBAs and the other is the merely mediocre DBAs. And when you create one of these, you can put in some controls, like maybe the merely mediocre DBAs are online from, let's say 8 p.m. to 7 a.m. or something like that. So you could change their availability. You can look at how they are set up to receive notifications, whether that's email or pager. I think they may eventually get rid of that option soon. And you can see a history of all the things that have happened with this particular operator. One thing I would recommend is that you do not create operators as specific people. So don't say Catherine is the person, the operator, because Catherine might go on vacation or get a promotion and leave the company or something like that. I've seen so many places where that DBA doesn't work there anymore and no one is getting those alerting messages. So what I suggest is you create a group, and then the group can all have that group Outlook inbox as one of their inboxes, and you just rotate whose responsibility it is to check that at a particular time. So then you come in, and at a minimum, what I recommend is you create alerts, and I have scripts for this if you need them, but you create alerts. And there's 3 different kinds you can choose from: a SQL Server event alert, a performance condition alert, and a WMI alert. So I recommend that you create at least alerts for severity level 18 through 25. And severity level 18 is the last of the purely informational messages. And so by doing this, you're going to get coverage for all of the major alerts on a particular SQL Server system. It will probably be noisy, and you probably will want to set certain alerts that you're getting a lot to be silent. But if nothing else, just enable these, and then you go over here to the response, and you say which of the operators are supposed to get these alerts as they happen. You could also say, for example, execute a job. So if severity level 24 alert goes off, run Atom Mechanics SP who is active for 2 minutes to try and collect more information to make sure we know what's happening on that particular SQL server. And so you'll get an email anytime you hit one of these alerts. Oops, I thought I changed that name. Let's go back. I did not change that name. Okay, so now I've got it as 24. The other 2 types of alerts are the WMI alerts and the performance alerts. So what you can do here under the performance condition alerts is you could come in and say, hey, you know what? I want to make sure that my SQL server tells me anytime I have a specific situation. Let's say if I have, let's go to general statistics, and we'll choose the counter, I don't know. Let's say logins per second. And I know this particular SQL server is not very heavily used. So I could say if the logins per second rises above 3, because I normally only have 12 people, 10 to 12 people active during the day and none at night. So if it rises above 3 in 1 second, I want you to send me an alert, because we've had a couple people perpetrators trying to do a SQL injection attack on our server. So I want to be notified when that specific performance event happens. You could do the same thing for, if CPU hits 80% or different things like that. The WMI counter alert is for a situation in which you want to manage something on the Windows level. So let's say the dev team has written a middleware service and it's only supposed to use 64 megabytes of RAM. So you could watch that service, and if you're worried about memory leaks, you could say, let me know if it rises above 64 megabytes of RAM while it's running. So you can do all kinds of pretty cool things here. The only big weakness is that you're basically using SQL Server to monitor SQL Server. So, if it crashes, there's a really good chance that you won't get notified. It'll just disappear. Okay. And the other big weakness, I guess you could say, is that it has no history. So it can't really help you correlate behaviors and detect trends. Okay? So let's go ahead and flip back. Daniel, before I go back into the slides, any questions at this point?
We didn't. We just did have David Klee and myself both agree that the SQL Server 2005 Practical Troubleshooting book was a wonderful book we both enjoyed for getting some good troubleshooting as well. I've read that one. I haven't read yours or Jonathan's, but it goes through some great methodology, and that even though it says 2005, it's still very applicable. So don't let that date, deter you.
Exactly. Yeah, good stuff. Okay, so let's move on. I have an entire session on this specific topic. When you're thinking about SQL Server and running SQL Server, you may not know the deep history of the product. SQL Server was originally created by Microsoft. And when I say created, that's a little bit of a misdirection. It was actually bought from Sybase. And so they basically built SQL Server on top of Sybase's Windows product. Well, it wasn't Windows at the time, it was OS2 product. And the idea was to be a departmental database, not the big mainframe sized computing system for the entire enterprise. And so the idea that the team had in adding features and building the product over the decades has been that we want SQL Server to be easy to get up and running, because the person who's setting it up might not really be an IT person. They may have just bought a packaged application for the finance department, and they're a financier or something like that. So the idea was, if we have to choose between two options when we set up the default behavior of SQL Server, and one of those options improves performance, and the other option improves stability and reliability, we're actually always going to choose the one that provides better reliability. And that's great, because again, SQL Server has long been marketed as kind of a lights out application. You can put it up, set it up, stand it up, walk out of the server room and turn off the lights, and you never have to worry about it. The downside to that, though, is as times have changed, as the technology has advanced, a lot of those configuration settings that were pretty well balanced between performance and reliability have gotten way out of whack now. And so in many cases, they can actually hamper performance without giving you a reliability improvement. So for example, there is the way that default files and file groups are set up. They recognize that this was an issue, that most databases are going to do better by having multiple database files, not multiple transaction log files, but database files. And so now you'll see that SQL Server in its recent versions always creates multiple tempdb database files, but it still doesn't do that for user database files. There's features for auto-growing and auto-shrinking SQL Server databases that can be a problem. There are features for auto-updating indexes and statistics in a database. But those default settings are not really very well optimized. And there's a lot of settings for the server level of performance and the database level that also aren't great. So we could argue quite a lot, or discuss quite a lot, how parallelism works in SQL Server as a default setting. It needs a lot of help and tinkering. And again, if you don't know what these settings should be, then take a look at the webinar on that topic, and or read the blog post on that topic on the SQL Performance website. But here's one example. When we set up a database in SQL Server, it has very, very small file sizes. So for the transaction log, 1 megabyte. For the database file, 3. And then they are set up to grow in inconsistent ways. So typically what most DBAs like to do is they want to create a database that's a nice big size so that you won't ever have to make it auto grow. And they also want it to auto grow in a very consistent way. However, one of the choices that you have is you can have a database or database log file grow by a percentage. So that means the first time a 100 gigabyte database or transaction log file grows, it grows by 10%, making it 110 gigabytes in size. The second time it grows, it's 10% of that total, which means it would grow by 10.1 gigabytes in size. And then the next time it will grow would be 10.11 gigabytes. So each time it grows, it would be a different size. And that's not a recipe for consistent and stable and predictable results. So keep that in mind. The defaults are there to keep SQL Server up and running, but they're not there to ensure that it performs quickly. Another big issue that I experience time after time is that, well, to be blunt, a lot of DBAs don't pay attention to security. What happens in a lot of places is the dev team is building this new application and they're thinking, okay, well, the devs, the DBA guys, that team, they have the grant statement and the revoke statement. So they're going to create users and give them permissions to all the low-level stuff. So they're going to handle security. And then the DBAs are thinking, well, the identity management team is the team that creates accounts for people in our company. And so the identity management team is going to take care of security. And then that team is thinking, well, the developers are writing the whole login access process for SQL, this new SQL Server app. So clearly the devs are going to take care of it. And in the end, no one takes care of it. The reason I bring this up is not to tell you that you need to become a security expert. What I'm trying to convey is that be watchful. And if you aren't thinking about it and you don't know who is, then ask questions to make sure you know that someone is taking care of your SQL servers, right, in terms of their security. And again, one of the reasons to bring this up is that there are lots and lots of different kinds of hacks that can be perpetrated against the company's IT infrastructure. But the one hack that causes the most damage is SQL injection. So yeah, there's man in the middle and DDoS and all kinds of different hacks like that. But those are so well known that they're actually fairly easy to combat unless you pay no attention to security. It's when someone, some adversary figures out how to get into your system and how to get a look at your SQL databases, that they are able to actually cause damage that costs you money, costs you customers, lost revenue, who knows what else. And the crazy thing about SQL injection is that it has been around since SQL and web pages have been around. So there's well-known solutions for SQL injection problems. Don't be lax about security. Pay attention, and if no one has it as part of their purview, then ask around to see if that can be added to the requirements and that someone can be put in charge of it. Maybe not you, or maybe it is you. Number 5 on the list is inadequate automation. And this is a mistake I see most frequently made by DBAs in small shops. So there's a half dozen SQL servers. And so they just use the GUI for everything. The problem with just using the GUI for everything means you're going to work harder, though. You're not going to work smarter. So what happens is when you're using, well, there's a couple things at play here. When you use the GUI, you're going to be tired. You're going to be irritated, irritable, want to go home, but for whatever reason, you've had to stay late. And you're going to make a mistake. It's going to happen. That's what happens with human beings. And I've done it a few times myself and have had to call my family at 2 a.m. and say, yeah, I'm not going to be here home at 2 a.m. I'm going to be home 2 more hours from now because I just screwed up what I meant to fix. So one of the things that's great is if you can use scripting as our main form of automation, whether that's T-SQL scripts or other kinds of scripts. it enables you to scale out. Now I don't have to worry that I have 6 servers and I'm now put in charge of another 10 servers because I have scripts that can take care of all of that. It's actually very little additional work to scale up the number of servers that you have to administrate. And so that means that you can move from this kind of manual firefighting mode to controlling all of your database processes, the administrative stuff, with some really solid scripts that work every single time you run them. And I want to underline that this is a sharing community. The SQL Server world is full of people who share code. So, for example, dbatools.io. This is a collection of over 500 different scripts written in PowerShell, but specifically for SQL Server people. So one example of one of the scripts that I like and use is a very frequent request I would get is, here's our production database, and we as the QA team want you to give us the latest version of the production database so we can, update our testing. Well, that used to be a, long and annoying process for me. Okay, I'll back it up and then I'll restore it on your server. There's a PowerShell script now in that dbatools.io collection of resources that you just run the script and off it goes, and you're pretty much assured that it's going to work. Very, very powerful set of tools, very, very well supported. There's a ton of developers who are keeping up with it, and so if you even have a bug fix request or something along those lines, they are out there ready for you to make a suggestion or offer an improvement. This again is another attitudinal problem, number 4 on the list. Wrong feature or technique for the job. A lot of times, particularly if we have a development background, as I did, one of the things I loved to do was to build new stuff. And the key word in that phrase is new, right? I wanted to build something new. It was like Legos, it's like, oh my God, I got the new, have you seen the new Stormtrooper helmet headsets from Lego? Oh, I can't wait to get it. I'm going to build this new cool thing. And what I found was the DBA that worked on the projects at NASA, he was the person most likely to thwart my, my request to move something into production, because he took his job very seriously in terms of the idea that he was the reliability person for this code. He was the risk manager for this application. And because I like to roll things out very quickly, and maybe I wasn't doing quite a good job at testing as I should have, he knew that it shouldn't just be rolled out right away. He also knew that if there was some new feature in the tool set that rolled out, I would want to start coding with that, whatever it was. And really what he would always come back to me and say, and which I now say, but at the time I resented, he'd say, let's go with this other feature over here that we know is rock solid and reliable. This new feature that just came out, we don't know a lot of it. We don't know how to troubleshoot it. We don't know how the vendor is going to support it. So let's just make sure we get really familiar with that first before we deploy it to production. And so, I had situations where I was just saying, ooh, shiny, let's use that. It's cool. When in fact, I wasn't thinking about whether it would impact the uptime of the SQL Server application or not. The other thing I want to point out, and I'm not throwing stones at Microsoft, but it's occurred just too many times over and over again in my career to not pay attention to, which is Microsoft throws a lot of new features at the wall to see which of them stick, and not all of them do. So if you deploy and build a lot of new stuff on a particular new feature, there's a chance it won't be around. Or if it is around, it's not supported in the way they initially conceived of it. So back, I think it was around SQL Server 2005, that release included Service Broker. Lots and lots of people were building new applications using Service Broker because they were like, whoa, this is new and cool. And I hate to say this, but while Service Broker is still there, and it does have some very, very powerful capabilities, I don't think it's had a single major update that I can think of since 2005. So it was solid. They rolled it out. It serves its purposes. They're never going to get rid of it because it's used internally inside a SQL Server. But on the flip side, they're never going to add anything to it either. So that might not be the right way to roll out a particular set of capabilities in your products. This whole concept of choosing the right tool for the job goes back to the idea of there aren't really IT projects. What we really have are organizational or business projects that we solve using IT. And plenty of times we can have a project that we're working on. We're going to solve this problem using all kinds of development features, when at the end of the day, we didn't have to start a 3-month project to rebuild things. I'll give you an example, and it's an old one, but it is it's still relevant. There was this thing called Y2K, and does anybody remember that? Raise a hand. People were terrified that all of their systems were going to shut down, and there were a lot of hoaxsters telling us that airplanes would come crashing out of the sky and dialysis machines wouldn't work anymore, and a lot of stuff like that. That wasn't the case at all. But a lot of companies spent bazillions of dollars like rewriting their entire IT set of applications because on a very tight timeline, and paid enormous amounts of overtime, and paid contract fees to a bunch of companies in India to hit this deadline to get everything rewritten in time to change 2-digit year fields to 4-digit year fields. And yet one company I worked with that was a retail company, what they did to answer this Y2K problem for their point of sale terminal systems, so they just made sure that every one of those POS system, point of sale terminals, they made sure that every single one of them had one of those old-fashioned swipers for credit cards, and they had a bunch of extra carbon copies, because everybody had been used to kind of typing in the number for the credit card or those kind of things. And so the idea was, let's just do it old-fashioned way. I mean, this will work even if the power goes out, and that was something a lot of people were worried about. Let's just use a paper solution to solve the problem. And that way, yeah, we are trying to modernize everything, but we don't have a deadline. We can finish it whenever we need to. So remember, IT is a way to solve a problem. It's a way to achieve a specific ends. But that doesn't mean that the ends always has to be technology. If you're smart and creative, there's plenty of opportunity to fix a problem without even getting IT involved. All right, number 3, apathy about coding and change management. So a lot of DBAs think of T-SQL as something that the devs do. This is actually a very interesting direction that one of my competitor / friend organizations, a company called Redgate, they're focusing really hard on code management, code change, continuous integration, continuous development, DevOps, those kind of things. And a lot of DBAs think they're not, that doesn't apply to them. And I think that's a little bit harmful for you, a little bit apathetic. You need to think of code and the database itself as a collection of code. And so you want to be able to manage these artifacts in a way that you can do continuous integration, continuous development, and that you can also roll back any of these if you ever need to do that. So one thing that I have talked to a lot of DBAs over the years about is how few of them do code reviews, T-SQL code reviews, to at least make sure that the most significant best practices are being adhered to in the code being written by their dev teams. You'll also see a lot of vendor applications that are purchased and installed on SQL Server, and no one ever looks at them. And I'll tell you what, if you ever run into a vendor who's selling a product that runs on SQL Server and MySQL and Postgres and Oracle, what have you, and they tell you that it runs equally well on all of those platforms, what they really mean is it runs equally crap on all of those platforms. And so take a look at those. I even have a full hour webinar on the kind of scripts and things that I run as automated tests on these vendor products to just validate how good they are at creating databases and code that runs against databases. That's called vendor red flag radar is what I call that session. Another thing to be aware of is that ORM generated apps are typically pretty crappy. Entity relationship in the last couple releases has gotten better, but it still has some significant problems. Slightly older versions have big problems, and every version of Hibernate since time began has big problems. They cause all kinds of issues with how they declare primary keys, how they do data types, and how they have all kinds of implicit conversion issues inside of those database systems. And then another point to keep in mind is that idea of keeping track of your database changes as they happen over time in case you ever have to roll them back. There's few things harder for a DBA to manage than a piecemeal rollback where they have to keep data in the database, but they have to roll back, say, certain stored procedures or things that were rolled out into the production environment. So make sure you have a code management system that takes all of that into account as well. All right, we're down to the top two, and I haven't checked time to see where we're at here, but let's go forward with that. Number 2 on the list is inadequate preventative maintenance. Okay, so remember before when I told you about how SQL Server was made to be created with the idea of resilience and reliability. However, there are a lot of things, just like a car needs a regularly scheduled oil change, and it needs tune-ups, and you have to change the tires out as they begin to wear down. Same thing for SQL Server. Things like indexes, statistics, things like rebuilding versus reorging, doing different kinds of consistency checks to make sure there's no corruption in your databases, things like verification of your backups, okay? So these are all critical. Many times I've spoken at conferences and I'll have people say, you know, can you help us figure out why when we first created the database a year ago, it's lightning fast and it's grown by a little bit. Let's say it's 50% bigger than it was back then, but now it is super slow. Won't update an index's statistics unless it is changed by at least 20%. So that's one of the big issues that you might have. The good news again is that you don't have to invent these preventative maintenance routines. They already exist. They have been written and vetted by others out there. So Ola Hallengren has probably the most popular set of code out there for this purpose. And gosh, I first wrote about his stuff for SQL Server magazine, I think around the year 2005. So it's been around a long time. It's extremely robust. It's very capable. It's really good, well tested. In fact, the dbatools.io group have some different PowerShell scripts that will invoke Ola Hallengren's tools for you and, you know, manage that as well. Then there's also some troubleshooting tools out there that I want to make sure you know about. I mentioned in passing Atom Mechanics, SP, Who is Active, fantastic tool. Brent Ozar has this first responder kit, and it's outstanding as well. And if you know Brent or have listened to any of his videos or things like that, even the comments are kind of witty and fun to read. And then Glenn Berry, who I mentioned earlier, he has another set of scripts called the SQL Server Diagnostic Queries. And one thing that's cool about Glenn's queries is that they anytime there's a new release or even a significant cumulative update release, he updates those scripts to make sure that they work. So, you know, you don't have to rely on something that was written for 2016 on your new 2017 SQL Server, 2019 SQL Server. He always keeps up with the latest. This is the number one mistake that DBAs make, which is to think that backups equal recovery. But the truth is, just because you've taken a backup doesn't mean you can recover that SQL Server database, okay? So it's the only one on the list that I have known a person to be fired over, because they're like, yeah, I've got backups, but all of them are corrupt. And I go back to the day before and it's corrupted. And, you know, the boss was like, forget it. I'll find someone who can fix this problem. So what we have here is a situation where SQL Server will allow you to back up a database that is completely corrupted. And then you turn around and take that database file and try to restore it to a server, and it won't. It'll say, can't restore a corrupted database. I'm paraphrasing. Can't restore this corrupted database. Go to your last good backup. This is a massive issue, right? In fact, the few times that it happened to me in the past, it was so traumatizing and traumatic that we made backup recovery testing a quarterly drill, where we would start from a clean server and rebuild the whole thing to include SQL Server and all the different kinds of things like MDAC and stuff like that that was needed for connectivity and everything, until a user would verify and say, yep, it's up and running. And again, that's really important because, like in one case, we didn't install, what we did is we installed the newest version of Windows, the newest version of SQL Server, and then I went in and verified through Enterprise Manager. That tells you how long ago it was. But I went in and looked at the data and said, yep, all the data is the very latest data. So we have effectively accomplished a point-in-time recovery. And I called the dev lead and said, hey, it's good to go. And then the dev lead called me back and said, no, the server doesn't work for us. And so what I came to find out was that whatever front-end tool they used had encountered a breaking change in the Microsoft Data Access component, and it couldn't connect to the SQL Server. So we actually had to step down to the older version of Windows and SQL Server that was installed on that server, and then reinstall the database and what have you, so that it would run in accordance to what the application had. So a recovery doesn't happen until your end users agree that it is recovered and usable. So that's why you need to do these recovery test drills. The other thing I found that is really cool is that when you have a big important outage and you have to recover, well, hopefully you've even got like high availability capabilities, like an availability group, and you can just fail over and only be out for a couple minutes, if that much. But one of the things I found when I did have to do a restore to bring a database online, because I had done recovery drills, I knew how long it took to complete the full recovery the last time we did a drill. And so I've had situations before I knew that information where we'd have an important production server crash, and the CIO or the deputy CIO would then spend the next hour in my office waiting for things to get brought back online, pacing and, you know, talking on the phone, and there's nothing I wanted less than to have the CIO hang out with me for the next hour while people were annoyed trying to get this system back online. So once we got to the point where we were doing drills regularly, I said to the deputy CIO in this case, I said, hey, why don't you just come back in 45 minutes? I'm 99% positive we'll be ready to go at that point. And he said, well, how do you know that? And I said, well, the last time we did a drill, it took about 42 minutes for us to get completely recovered. And since we've had a little bit of growth since then, I'm going to give it a tiny bit of padding and say 45 minutes. And the deputy CIO said, you know what? Okay, I'll do that. I'll be back in 45 minutes. And sure enough, it was ready to go. So that's the number one mistake that DBAs make, thinking that a backup equals the ability to recover. That's not the case. One other side note there, last bullet on the list, is archival data. So maybe you're at a company that because of Sarbanes-Oxley, it requires you to keep 7 years of archival data for the finances, or other legal requirements. When they announced Sarbanes-Oxley, we actually did a drill to see if we could recover 7-year-old data. And in our case, what we had was we would take tapes, and then once a week, we'd ship those off to Iron Mountain. And so we called Iron Mountain. They brought back a set of 7-year-old tapes. And so here we have our tape, and we go up to the first server, and lo and behold, it doesn't fit in the tape drive. And then we go down to the next rack that has a tape drive, doesn't work there. We ended up having to go to eBay and buy an old tape drive system, because we didn't even have tape drives that could access that data anymore. So think about that a little bit when you're also thinking about archival data. How do you get to it if you ever need to? Because it's possible it might be on a media or a format that does not lend itself to actually being used. Okay, so bottom line for a DBA is it's about the data, not about the tools. It's not about other aspects, the servers. It's about the data all the time, every time. Who can see it, how quickly they can see it. You want to make sure that as the guardian of the data, it gets to the right people at the right time and under the right circumstances, securely. That's what it's about. Another thing I want to point out, and I always give a little bit of time for this, is that there has been a large body of research conducted by both U.S. Department of Defense and a couple prominent and well-known universities around what makes a DBA team successful. And it's called the Information Management Maturity Model. And so I actually learned this in the 3.5 years I worked for the Department of Defense. And I was over here on level 0, chaos. I had people calling me directly. Nothing that we did was documented. Every week it was unpredictable as to whether I'd get a lot of new code written or whether I'd have to spend the whole week fighting fires. I was, measuring progress by how much the phone rang. And what that meant was the end users were mad because the system had a stoppage and were calling me to fix it. And I didn't know that it had stopped. So notice here on level 1, one of the very first things you have to get implemented is down here towards the middle bottom, and that's alerting and event management. Once you get that in place, you can begin to build on top of having the system tell you when things are down rather than end users, and you can get ahead of your firefighting. You can start to stabilize and standardize your processes and your SQL servers and the inventory and such. Then you begin to add value. So like at level 2, now we're doing things like we're predicting problems. We're not just monitoring the components, we're monitoring what the end user's experience is like. We can see trends. We can tell we're going to run out of hardware CPU capacity, not just storage capacity, but CPU capacity in a 18-month time frame. And then if you build on top of those levels, you start to do the things that we see typically only in really well-run enterprises, such as have guaranteed SLAs. You have capacity management. You have kind of data science for the database systems, knowing what kind of cluster of problems indicate a server failure versus a cluster of other problems that just means that a router has gone down between Boston and the headquarters. So it's once you get to level 2, 3, and 4, that's when you become more and more and more valuable, not just to the IT team, but to the entire business overall. And now you're starting to suggest things that make the business better, not just the database better or the application better. I have, again, a full hour on this discussion as well if you're interested in learning more about the information maturity model. All right, so a few of these blunders are directly related to your technical skills. Things like how storage works and how it's so important for throughput, things like not having a technology methodology, and things like just going with the server defaults. But a lot of these problems, these blunders that DBAs make, they're they're business or people problems, right? Maybe attitude problems, like security is an afterthought. If you're apathetic about security, not much is going to be done with regards to securing your SQL Server. If you're really into using whatever's new rather than whatever's very reliable and tried and true and trusted, then you introduce risk into your SQL Server systems, and so you can cause problems there. So that's kind of the way I think. I tend to think of our top 10 list. Things technology, there's not as many of those as there are things about process, attitudes, and the way we work with our business. Okay. So don't forget to download Plan Explorer. Don't forget to connect with me on Twitter, LinkedIn, and stuff. And now, but just before we take a break, let's go ahead and give away one of those 2 copies of SQL in a Nutshell. So Daniel, how many folks do we have online?
Right now we're showing 32.
Okay, let's do this. I am going to do something that I like to do because I'm a D&D nerd. Anyone else on here play D&D with me?
I specifically play D&D with you, actually.
Yes, Daniel and I actually do play D&D together. But if you just go to Google, you can type in things like dice rolls, 1d20, for example, and it'll roll the dice for you. So let's go with number 17. Dan, who's number 17 on your list?
Would you be able to roll a D32?
I can't do that. Tell you what, let's do this. Let's do 2d20.
Okay.
And if it goes over, we'll just wrap around, right?
Oh, all right. We'll do that. Go ahead.
All right. Let's see what we come up with here. Beep, 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 beep. It says, there we go. Number 21.
Or 3. What do you want to go with?
Or 3. Actually, you're right. That is number 3.
All right.
Shame on me.
According to my list, I'm showing it as Angela Hills.
Angela, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Woohoo! So this is an ebook. And so if you will send me an email, kkline@century1.com, then, and just mention the session today. What I'll do is I'll contact my editor at O'Reilly, and they'll create, if you haven't created an O'Reilly media account, I think they'll request that you do, and they'll just drop that $50 book in there for you.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you. All right, so Dan, tell me what the next step is here at this point.
All right. Well, I wanted to make a couple comments on some of the stuff you were talking about. Your alerting slides actually go very well with one of the sections that what I'm talking about with one of my extended events. And I love that you're talking about DBA tools. My most recent, though, your comment about finding an ooh shiny was that my newest ooh shiny is Query Store, and unfortunately, I do throw that on almost every single instance that I have. So I absolutely love that tool.
That's not to say it's going to lead you astray or anything like that.
Oh yeah,
but occasionally that does happen.
Yes. And I do have to say, though, I think the reason why Service Broker hasn't needed anything updated for it was because they wrote it perfectly, and Remus Rasanu documented it so well that it just explains everything. So
that's fun. I actually after it was released, I talked to the dev manager of that product, and they had so many plans. They had a very impressive roadmap for Service Broker. Like they had a whole set of capabilities around contingency management. So like if you had 2 endpoints that you wanted your broker to manage, and one of them went down, then it could have a failover contingency where it's sent to a different none of that ever happened.
Yeah.
You know, so that does happen quite a bit over time. You might remember DAC packs.
Mhm.
You might remember, oh gosh, there's so many different things that have happened like that
Yep.
over the years, and not just ancient history stuff. It
Yep.
continues to happen.
The last two things I wanted to just comment on from what you were saying, again, with the DBA tools, if you're testing your backups, they have a test DBA last backup, and it will actually generate run the copy, it will restore it, it will check it, it will run a dbcc check db, it will send you the output, and it will drop it. So
Fantastic.
it's got it, and you don't have to restore it on the same server. You can do it onto a dev server. You know, take the backup, and it automates it. So do check that command out. And then the other one that's been very important to me is the export DBA instance. That actually exports basically all of the scripts you would need to run if you needed to rebuild the server entirely. So all your logins, your objects, credentials, link servers, triggers, audits, endpoints, everything, you have the scripts. So, because again, yes, if all you have is your back, your BAK files, how long is it going to take you to restore? Could take a while. So
yeah, and not only that, like you said, a lot of what's pertinent to that user database is stored in either master or MSDB. So you actually got to, if you use jobs heavily, you got to restore MSDB too.
Yep.
So yeah, great point.
All right. So I've got 2-3 quick demos on some extended events I wanted to show that I've used for, tracking errors, and also a specific one in regards to some issues I dealt with for some link server issues. We all know we love it, link servers. Kevin, can you go ahead and pass host back over to me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you want to take a break now, or?
Yeah, we can totally take a break. We could just do a quick 5-minute, and then we'll go ahead and resume at that point. And I'll start it off and then pass it back to you.
All right. So I'm going to go ahead and make you host now, so you can you can start anytime you're ready. But let's go ahead and take 5 minutes, folks. I need to refill my drink and make a quick bio break, and so I'll be back in just a moment. If in the interim you have any questions, it could be about anything. Feel free to drop it into the chat or come off of mute, and we can chat about that as well. All right.
All right.
So I'll be back in just a moment.
Yep.